Welcome to Education in Focus. I'm your host, Aliana Kernodle. The American Civil Liberties Union of Pennsylvania is asking school leaders in the state to resist federal immigration enforcement agency actions on school grounds after the Trump administration rescinded guidance preventing enforcement efforts near schools. Joining me to dig into this is Chalkboard News editor Brendan Clary. Brendan, what is the Trump administration's policy on ICE efforts in schools?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Essentially, the Trump administration rolled back what were prior sort of guidelines that prevented federal immigration enforcement agencies from going to like sanctuary zones, right, like schools and churches and these different kinds of areas where they would not enforce these sort of immigration warrants, that kind of thing. So that's kind of the background. Trump, as most of us remember, from the campaign trail, Trump was talking about this often, and this was one of the big campaign promises to close the border and really crack down on immigration. And this was a big talking point, from him and his campaign against the Biden-Harris campaign about these sorts of issues, the border and immigration. And so he did, after he took office, immediately started rolling back some of these kinds of policies. And that included the school property sort of policy where immigration enforcement agents would not go on school property. So that's kind of the background. And I do want to note that there have been no reported cases of immigration enforcement going into schools or going onto a school zone or school property and enforcing any of these immigration warrants. That's not something that we've seen reported yet. So, there's been a lot of different reports, I mean, almost daily in different parts of the U.S. about people being afraid of that or families or school districts responding. But there hasn't been any reported cases so far of immigration enforcement, going to a school and saying we have a warrant or we're going to try to use it right now. And we haven't seen that yet.
Then what did the ACLU of Pennsylvania say in this letter to school leaders?
Yeah, it was along the same vein of being kind of worried about what could happen given the Trump administration policy rescinding that previous guidance on those safe zones. They essentially told school leaders, CEOs, and directors to not comply as much as possible. So that was kind of the tone of the letter was you don't have to do certain things if you don't want to. You don't have to comply with federal immigration officers unless there are these very specific instances. So that was the tone of the letter, was saying you don't have to comply without, specific warrants from a judge or, these different kinds of things. So specifically, they said that Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which is ICE, or Customs and Border Protection agents don't have to, can be blocked from entering schools. They can be blocked from accessing information about students, and they also can be blocked from having certain contact with students or staff. So they basically kind of laid out, they said you should have policies in place that if a federal agent says, I want to enforce this warrant, like you have somebody like a chain of command so that a school staff member, for example, if they're outside on a playground and they see immigration enforcement. And again, this has not happened yet, but this is sort of like the scenario that is kind of posed by the ACLU of Pennsylvania, is that if somebody comes in with a warrant knocking on the school door, outside at a playground, that you would direct that directly to a school district's lawyers and principal or superintendent. So you'd have like a chain of command built up. And I think, it's a good idea to be thinking ahead. Like, I don't think anybody would say, oh, that's a big problem. Like if you have sort of this sort of legal situation potentially coming, like I don't think it's a bad idea to plan ahead, but it definitely did lean into saying like you don't have to comply unless you're forced to by law, right? So there was that idea of even though you're a public school district, you don't have to comply with federal agencies if you don't want to. Another thing too is they talked about judicial warrants, so that was an interesting kind of explanation about that specific legal framework that ICE uses. So it says, the letter said ICE typically does not use judicial warrants. Instead, they commonly rely on administrative warrants signed by an immigration officer or immigration judge. And unlike judicial warrants, administrative warrants do not give ICE agents authority to enter areas of school property that are not otherwise open to the public. So just kind of an interesting sort of, explanation of some of the specific legal things that was also in the letter. So it's just kind of an interesting sort of background for these school districts, and kind of points to a lot of the cultural sort of tension between, you have the more maybe progressive ACLU advocates for immigrants, and then you have the Trump administration, and then you maybe have these school staff in the middle.
And they also had some things to say about what parents can do as well. Yeah.
So one of the options that the ACLU of Pennsylvania provided to schools was that they could give families information about how to sort of plan for a contingency where if parents were deported, they could provide options for students to have a non-family member help them make education decisions. So this would essentially be family separation, right? If immigration enforcement took the parents and had a warrant for them and deported them, then they're saying there is a way to have to make it so that the child could be enrolled in the school and be represented in some of these kinds of education decisions, parent-teacher conferences by somebody who's not actually their parent. And they say that that's an option of last resort, but that schools can make that information available because of Pennsylvania law. So that is the law in the state, is that can happen where a student can be represented by a non-guardian in these kinds of cases.
And they aren't the only ones who are concerned about ICE in schools. This is part of a larger national conversation, like you mentioned earlier. What are others saying?
Yeah, so there's a lot of school districts that have kind of gone on the record and said we're not going to comply with immigration and customs enforcement. And so there's been a lot of backlash to the Trump administration's efforts to crack down on illegal immigration or to deport people who they say are here illegally. So that is this is not like a one-off or like specific to Western Pennsylvania by any means.
And what has President Trump's border czar, Tom Homan, had to say on this issue?
Yeah, he's maintained that the federal government would try to deport families together and actually leave it up to them concerning whether they would be separated or not. So that kind of goes back to what the ACLU of Pennsylvania was telling schools to tell families who might be in this situation, is that it's kind of up to them to decide what they would want to do. And so Homan kind of echoed that. And he told the Washington Post, he said, here's the issue. You knew you were in the country illegally and chose to have a child, so you put your family in that position. So we kind of flipped the script around a little bit there and said, families who are here and they know that they're breaking the law because they crossed the border illegally, they have to decide whether or not they want to separate, but they have to kind of decide that for themselves. So I think that's where the Trump administration is landing on that.
Well, Brendan, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at chalkboardnews.com.